No, not at all. You are the manager of the hotel, and this is your job anyway. The twin sisters were able to clean this room in a very short time. Then one of them passed away and the other left the job. So I chose 2 other employees to do this job. I always choose 2 who have a very good relationship to enter the room, hoping that the connection between them protects them exactly. And you have the right to laugh at all this at your convenience, Mr. Enslin. But you will feel that there is something in the room as soon as you enter it. I'm sure of that whoever lives in this room is not shy at all. I used to enter the room a lot with the employees to supervise the cleaning, and most importantly, to get them out of the room if something happened. Until now, nothing happened. There were rare cases where some of them entered the room with a sudden burst of tears for no reason, and in other cases they entered the room with a hysterical burst of laughter. I don't know how someone can laugh for no reason, and without controlling himself he can be more scary than someone who cries for no reason. But it's true, some of them were in a state of deep silence. Besides that, I don't think anything important happened during the past years. I used to keep them in this room with some initial experiments with mobile phones, digital devices, and the like. Despite my observations regarding digital devices, nothing happened. And thank God for that. The manager stopped talking for a second, and then he said one of them fainted. Yes, fainted. Her name was Romy Van Gilder. She was cleaning the floor on the TV, and suddenly she started screaming. I asked her, "What's wrong?" She threw the dustbin out of her hand and put her hands on her eyes and screamed. She screamed and said that she fainted, that she couldn't see anything but a mixture of colors, and that's it. As soon as I took her out of the room, the colors disappeared, and until she got to the elevator, her vision returned to her. Are you trying to scare me with this? Is this what you're trying to do now? Mr. Olin, of course not. You know the history of the room that started with the first suicide that I mentioned. Mike knew this information. Kevin O'Malley, a tailor who committed suicide on October 13th, 1910, he jumped out of the window and left behind a bucket, and 7 children, 5 men, and 1 woman. All of them jumped out of the window. Mr. Enslin, 3 women and 1 man, died of a high fever from the sedatives, and 2 were found in the bed, and 2 were found in the bathroom, and 1 committed suicide in 1970. Another one after he cut his hand, cut his genitals. What I want to say, Mr. Enslin, is that if all these stories didn't scare you out of the room, then of course my stories about the servants who cleaned the room won't succeed in this mission. The servants who stopped to enter this room are very few, more than a few, except for the 2 sisters. Exactly, Mike wasn't very interested in the stories of the cleaners, and he was a bit annoyed by the mention of the suicide director. As if Mike didn't know what happened or didn't know the essence of this suicide, except that in fact it doesn't have any essence. Abraham Lincoln and John Kennedy both had their deputies named Johnson, whose names are composed of 7 letters. Lincoln was elected in 1860 and Kennedy in 1960. What is the point of these similarities? Nothing. These suicide stories will be very useful in the book, of course, but since the recording device is off, let me tell you my real opinion. These stories are not evidence of anything in general, Mr. Enslin. Listen to me carefully. Please, the twin sister, after leaving the hotel, died of a heart attack before that. The Alzheimer's disease was already destroying her mind, even though she was very young at that time. And let us also remember that her sister is still working in the hotel, and her health is still good. That's a success story. And you too. How many times did you enter the room? 100 times? 200? And I also see you sitting in front of me well and healthy, but you seem to be sitting in front of me in a good and healthy way. But that's only for a few short moments. I enter and exit at once. It's like entering a room full of drawers. As long as you're holding your breath, you'll be safe. Haha. It's obvious you're not convinced of this similarity, but I see it as the closest thing to reality. And it's also possible that the reactions towards any person in this room are different from one another in their severity and violence. Since this hotel was built about a century ago, and every hotel staff knows that this room is designated, it's now an integral part of the building's history. But no one talks about it. Just like no one mentions the fact that the 14th floor in every hotel is actually the 13th floor, but we change its number because of the flying. And if we had more information about this room, we might have been able to draw a bigger picture, and it would have been a more scary picture than your reader's ability to guess. I remember that every hotel in New York has had suicide cases. That's a fact. But I see it with my own eyes, that there's nothing but this hotel that has had more than a dozen suicide cases in just one room. That's not a suicide case. And what we're going to argue about is that they were suicide cases. How many cases were those? 30 cases. At least 30, or... That's all we know, Mike asked, and he noticed that the idea of a suicide case in room 1408 has never been a threat to him before. He always thinks about suicide or violent death. Are you lying? He said the words before he thought, no, Mr. Insulin, I assure you that I'm not lying. You think that we decided to close this room because of pessimism or because of myths and legends that say that every hotel has a ghost, isn't that so? Mike noticed that this idea, the idea that every place has a ghost, is exactly the idea of a series of books 10 nights in a row, and this joke in Olin's voice made him feel a little embarrassed. In the hotel business, of course, there are myths and strange beliefs, but we don't let them affect the workflow. The most important thing is that there's nothing that makes a room stay unoccupied. There's a room available, and there's a guest, so the room stays. The only exception was room 1408. A room in the 13th floor, and the number of rooms on the door, also 13. The manager looked at Mike and continued, this is not just a room with suicide cases. No, there are cases of heart attacks, a stroke. There's a 1973 man who drowned in a soup dish in front of him, and you have the right to see all this nonsense. But I spoke to the manager at the time, and he confirmed that he had read the criminal medicine report. The power of this room stays is almost silent. During the afternoon, this is the time when the room is cleaned, and despite that, there are cases of heart attacks, stroke, diabetes. 3 years ago, there was a problem with heating in more than one room. Room 1408 was one of them. He did the maintenance and went in and out. Nothing happened to him. He didn't notice anything. But the next day, he died of a stroke. Coincidence? But Mike couldn't deny Olin's skills. If he had been in charge of the student camps, he would have been able to scare the students during the scary moments around the fire at night. Coincidence, Mike didn't hesitate and didn't react. He reached out his hand to the old key. What's the matter with you, Mr. Insulin? Blood pressure, any psychological problems? Mike felt that his hand was resisting moving towards the key, but as soon as he succeeded in moving it, it extended to the key. I'm very healthy. He held the big bronze medal and said, this is just my lucky tree shirt, Mike's story. The principal insisted that Mike take him to room 14, but Mike didn't. He noticed that as soon as they left the library room on their way to the elevator, the principal turned back to the same person he was in the beginning. Mr. Olin, the simple, humble, poor man, lost his shirt he was wearing in his office. He stopped them on the street. Wearing a dress, Mike realized that he was the principal. He gave the principal a piece of paper. The principal saw it and got angry. He left after thanking the principal. On their way, Mr. Olin asked Mike to give him the bag. Mike refused again, and they got on the elevator. Mike was on the top row, the 11th, 12th, and 14th rows. Mike thought of the number 13 as a joke. It doesn't mean that the 13th row isn't there anymore, that's a joke. But he knew that it's something that happens in almost every elevator in the world. The elevator moved. I'm curious about one thing. Why didn't you think of the 1408 room? If you're so afraid of the room, you could have said that you're staying in the room to avoid the requests to stay in it. Maybe I was afraid of being accused of being a thief. If I'm not a federal government employee and a quality follower in the elevators, then I'm a workaholic, the owners of the elevators. For them, it's an empty room in the hotel, and it's a good place to stay. They won't be convinced that just jumping from the window to the street is enough to get them out of the market. For Mike, this was the most annoying thing Olin had ever said. He stopped trying to convince him. He left all his ability to convince him in the office. When they got out of it, the number 12 light was on in the elevator, and he got out and it turned off. And the number 14 light was on. The elevator stopped, the door opened, and the empty road to the 14th floor appeared, in the golden red carpet that covered the whole road. Now we're here. Excuse me, I can't continue with you any further. You'll find your room on the left at the end of the road. If there's no need to go there, I've never been so close to a room. Since that day, Mike got out of the elevator, and he felt his legs were heavier than usual. He turned around and looked at Olin, a short man, relatively full. His coat was black, and his white socks were tied up. His hands were now with a room behind his back, and Mike noticed that his face was very pale. He started to sweat. He started noticing his empty forehead. "There's a phone in the room, of course. You can use it if you feel something's wrong, but I doubt it'll work. If the room doesn't want to work, it won't happen." Mike thought in a nice response. If the phone doesn't work, will there be a discount on the price of the night? But his tongue was as heavy as his legs. He refused to move. Olin reached out to Mike. "Mr. Eslin, Mike, please don't enter this room, please." But the elevator door was closed and he didn't speak. Mike stood still for a moment, in complete silence. In the way of the New York hotel. In the role that no one in the hotel admitted to, that is actually the 13th role. For a moment he thought to reach out and push the elevator's call button, but he didn't. If he did,